In this episode, we're going to look at a topic that often sounds exciting in movies, but becomes complicated and serious the moment it touches real industrial systems. Testing security by acting like an attacker. When people first hear penetration testing, they may picture someone hammering on systems until something breaks, then celebrating that they proved a point. In operational technology, that mindset is dangerous because the systems you are assessing often control real equipment, real processes, and sometimes real safety functions, so the cost of disruption can be far higher than a broken laptop. The goal of OT testing is not drama, and it is not bragging rights, because the environment is not a playground, and it is not an experiment. Instead, the goal is to learn what is actually possible for an attacker or a mistake, while keeping the process stable and keeping people safe. You are trying to find weak links, validate assumptions, and improve defenses in ways that the operations team can accept and sustain. Understanding what testing can and cannot do, and how to do it safely, is a core beginner skill for OT security. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first step is to understand what a penetration test is at a high level without getting stuck on tool details. A penetration test is a planned activity where authorized testers try to find and exploit weaknesses to demonstrate real-world impact, such as gaining access, moving through a network, or changing a configuration. The reason this is valuable is that it can reveal gaps that paper reviews miss, like misconfigurations, unexpected connectivity, or workflow shortcuts that create hidden access paths. In many environments, people assume boundaries are strong because diagrams say they are, but real systems often behave differently than diagrams, and testing can expose that difference. Beginners sometimes think the purpose is to prove the security team is right or that the engineering team is wrong, but a healthy test is not a competition between teams. It is a controlled learning exercise that produces evidence about what is actually possible. In OT, the emphasis is often on validating whether critical zones are reachable, whether monitoring would detect key actions, and whether recovery plans are realistic if an event occurs. The value comes from turning assumptions into verified facts. Adversarial emulation is related, but it is not exactly the same thing, and the difference matters. Adversarial emulation means modeling the behavior of a realistic threat actor, including their objectives, their patience, and their methods, rather than simply trying to break into whatever seems easiest. The idea is to answer a question like, if a capable attacker tried to disrupt our process or manipulate our control, what would their path likely look like in our specific environment? This approach can be more strategic because it focuses on scenarios that matter, like reaching engineering tools, abusing remote support, or changing set points in logic. Beginners sometimes assume emulation is just a more dramatic form of testing, but its real purpose is prioritization and realism, not excitement. Emulation helps you test detection and response as well as prevention, because you can observe whether the organization notices and reacts to behaviors that resemble real attacks. It also helps you avoid chasing low-value findings, because you are not just collecting vulnerabilities, you are evaluating whether a meaningful failure path exists. In OT, that scenario focus is often where the most defensible security improvements come from. The phrase safety constraints is the heart of OT testing, because in OT, safety is not a side note, and it is not optional. A test that causes a process upset, a protective trip, or loss of operator visibility can create real risk to people and equipment, even if the test is authorized. That means OT testing must be designed to avoid causing unsafe states, and that is different from how many office network tests are conducted. Beginners may not realize that some common security test actions can overload fragile devices, trigger watchdog resets, or create unexpected network behavior that affects timing and control. OT devices may have limited resources and may respond poorly to high volumes of traffic or rapid connection attempts. And those technical realities become safety realities when the device controls physical equipment. Safety constraints also include operational constraints, like the fact that the plant may have strict production commitments and limited maintenance windows. A responsible test plan therefore starts by identifying what must not happen, such as causing downtime, impacting safety functions, or altering control logic on live systems. The goal is to learn without risking harm, and that requires discipline. Because of these constraints, OT tests often rely heavily on scoping and rules of engagement that are more detailed than many beginners expect. Scope defines what systems are in play, what techniques are allowed, and which outcomes are acceptable. Rules of engagement describe how the test will be executed safely, including communication channels, escalation procedures, and stop conditions. A stop condition is a clear trigger that ends the test immediately, such as unexpected process alarms, loss of visibility, or performance degradation that could affect safe operation. This is not bureaucratic overhead. It is the safety mechanism that lets everyone participate with confidence. Beginners sometimes think rules of engagement limit the value of the test, but in OT the opposite is usually true because a safe test is one that can be repeated, expanded, and trusted by operations. When teams know the test will not surprise them, they are more willing to share real information and allow meaningful coverage. Scoping also protects the organization from accidental changes because the plan should prohibit actions that could alter running control behavior. A well-scoped test is a controlled experiment, not a chaotic probe. A key beginner misunderstanding is believing that testing always means touching production systems directly, when in OT, that is often the least safe place to start. Many organizations use non-production environments, replicas, vendor test systems, or carefully isolated segments to learn about weaknesses without risking live operations. Even when perfect replicas do not exist, partial testing can still provide insight, such as validating boundary controls, remote access behavior, and monitoring effectiveness at the edges. This approach can feel less exciting to someone expecting direct exploits on controllers, but it often produces the most useful findings with the least risk. The goal is to determine whether a realistic pathway exists, and many pathways can be validated without ever sending disruptive traffic at critical devices. Beginners should also understand that safe testing can include passive observation and configuration review, which are less intrusive but still valuable for finding weak defaults and hidden connectivity. The testing strategy should match the environment's tolerance for disruption, which in OT is usually low. When you build confidence in safer areas first, you create a foundation for deeper assessment later, if it is justified and agreed. Another important concept is that OT testing should focus on consequences and safety impact, not just technical compromise. In office systems, proving you can obtain an administrative shell might be considered a major result, but in OT, the meaningful question is what that access allows you to do to process behavior, safety margins, and recovery. For example, access to a monitoring workstation might be concerning, but access to an engineering workstation that can modify logic is often more critical because it can change how the system behaves. Similarly, a finding that a device has a known vulnerability matters most when it sits on a critical path and has a practical exploit path within your architecture. Beginners sometimes get overwhelmed by lists of vulnerabilities, but a well-designed OT test is trying to validate a small number of high-impact scenarios. That might include whether an attacker can cross from business networks into control zones, whether remote support can be abused, or whether change detection would catch unauthorized logic modifications. The value of the test is in connecting technical findings to real consequences. When the test produces clear consequence-driven stories, decision-makers can act. Detection and response are often the most valuable parts of adversarial emulation in OT, because prevention is never perfect and visibility can be limited. An emulation can test whether monitoring detects unusual remote sessions, whether alerts are clear enough to be trusted, and whether response teams can coordinate without causing operational harm. Beginners sometimes imagine that security testing is mostly about breaking in, but in real OT resilience, the ability to notice and contain an issue early can matter more than the initial barrier. An emulation can reveal that controls exist but are not used, or that logs exist but are not reviewed, or that alarms are too noisy to interpret. It can also reveal gaps in communication, such as unclear escalation paths between security, operations, and engineering. In OT, response actions must be safe and coordinated, so testing response is not only about speed, it is about correctness under pressure. A well-run emulation helps teams practice making decisions with incomplete information while still respecting safety constraints. That practice is itself a form of risk reduction. A realistic OT testing conversation also includes the concept of what not to test, because there are areas where direct adversarial action is too risky or not worth the potential impact. Safety instrumented functions and other safety-critical systems may have strict restrictions, and changes or disruptions there can be unacceptable. Certain devices may be so fragile or so essential that direct traffic testing could cause downtime. And in those cases, you focus on architecture and boundary testing instead. Beginners sometimes think skipping direct testing means ignoring risk, but in OT, risk can be assessed through alternate evidence, such as configuration baselines, vendor guidance, network isolation validation, and strong monitoring at boundary points. The mature approach is to choose methods that yield insight without crossing safety lines. This is why collaboration with operations and safety teams is essential, because they understand which systems can tolerate which kinds of assessment. When the testing plan respects these realities, it builds trust and produces results that teams will actually implement. The most harmful outcome would be a test that damages credibility and makes future security work harder. Third-party involvement is another part of OT testing that beginners may not expect, because vendors and integrators often own knowledge and access that affects test realism. A test may need to account for vendor remote support paths, integrator configuration practices, and shared responsibility for patching and mitigation. If a vendor requires a specific access method, the test can evaluate how that method is controlled and monitored rather than pretending it does not exist. If an integrator maintains certain systems, the test can evaluate whether change records and access logs are sufficient to reconstruct what happened during support. The risk here is that a third-party pathway might become a high-impact weak link, especially if it is always on, uses shared credentials, or bypasses normal controls. A thoughtful test uses third-party realities as input, not as excuses, and it can drive practical improvements like time-bound access, session monitoring, and clearer approval flows. Beginners should understand that third-party risk is not only a procurement topic, it is a live operational risk that shows up in architecture and access. Testing can help quantify how much exposure those dependencies create and which controls reduce it. Planning for safety also means planning for recovery, because even the most careful test can reveal unexpected fragility. Recovery planning includes ensuring that configurations are backed up, that you can restore known good states, and that you have a clear process for verifying correctness after restoration. In OT, correctness matters as much as availability, because a system that is running with incorrect logic can be dangerous. Beginners sometimes assume recovery is simply turning things back on, but OT recovery often requires coordination, validation, and cautious reintroduction of systems into the process. A responsible OT test plan, therefore, includes who will respond if a system behaves unexpectedly, what steps will be taken to stabilize the environment, and how the test will be halted safely. This is not pessimism, it is professionalism, and it is part of why OT testing can be trusted when done well. Recovery planning also reinforces that testing is not separate from operations, it is embedded in operational readiness. When you plan for recovery, you reduce anxiety, and that makes teams more willing to participate in meaningful testing. The test becomes a controlled exercise rather than a risky gamble. The results of OT testing can also be misunderstood if they are presented poorly, so beginners need to know what good reporting looks like. A long list of technical issues can overwhelm stakeholders and lead to paralysis, especially if the issues are not tied to critical assets and real failure paths. A better report explains the scenarios tested, the pathways validated, and the observed ability to detect and respond, then connects findings to specific mitigations that fit the environment's constraints. The report should also be honest about limitations, such as areas not tested directly due to safety constraints, and what evidence was used instead. This honesty prevents false confidence and helps leadership understand where additional investment might be needed, like building safer test environments or improving monitoring coverage. Beginners sometimes think the purpose of a test report is to prove someone was wrong, but in OT the purpose is to guide improvement, so tone matters. A good report avoids blame and focuses on system behavior and control effectiveness. When reporting is clear and respectful, It increases the chance that findings lead to real change. It is also important to recognize that the value of OT penetration testing and adversarial emulation is highest when it is part of a broader risk program, not a one-time event. Testing can validate architecture reviews, verify that boundary controls work as intended, and reveal whether training and procedures hold up under realistic pressure. It can also measure improvement over time, such as showing that remote access pathways are now time-limited and monitored, or that segmentation prevents lateral movement in ways it did not before. Beginners sometimes treat testing as a trophy event, but in mature OT security, testing is feedback, and feedback supports continuous improvement. The best programs use testing results to adjust priorities, refine threat scenarios, and improve both preventive controls and recovery readiness. Testing also helps build shared understanding across teams because it turns theoretical discussions into observed behavior. When teams have shared evidence, they can coordinate better and argue less. Over time, that shared evidence becomes part of the organization's confidence in its defenses. Finally, understanding OT penetration tests and adversarial emulation is about balancing learning with responsibility, because in OT, the environment you are protecting is also an environment that must remain safe and stable. The safety constraints are real, and they require careful planning, clear scoping, disciplined execution, and collaborative communication with operations and safety stakeholders. At the same time, the value is real because testing can reveal hidden pathways, validate whether boundaries are defendable, and show whether detection and response can work under pressure. For beginners, the most useful mindset is to see testing as a way to reduce uncertainty about real failure paths, not as a way to create excitement or to prove cleverness. When you focus on realistic scenarios, meaningful mitigations, and evidence that supports decisions, testing becomes a practical tool for improving resilience. The best outcome is not a dramatic exploit, but a clearer understanding of weak links and a set of improvements that reduce likelihood and consequence without harming operations. That is how OT testing delivers value, and that is how you keep the work aligned with safety, reliability, and trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.